circumstances as a kind of control. But it's still a little worrying about whether this is genuinely a false belief task. It's possible that what the infant could do in this kind of situation, and this is something that I worry about, is that the infant could make a kind of association of intent between the person and the object. Obviously, it's been proved she wants that ball, so you know she will get the ball. When the person turns her head away, she becomes irrelevant to what happens next. But when she turns around again, you reactivate her intention towards the ball, if you like, and the box, and therefore you expect her to come back there. But it's not necessarily a belief state. This is the question. So APPERLY and BUTTERFILL have an interesting position on this difference between implicit and explicit belief, in which they say perhaps early theory of mind is like infants' early numerical understanding. That is, there's an innate or early understanding based on core knowledge. I described a little bit of this yesterday, but then it's overlaid by a more sophisticated understanding that depends and relies on having a linguistic representation, like counting in the case of number. So perhaps these two types of theory of mind can be described as an implicit form, which is innate and based on very early understandings of intention, and then is overlaid by something which requires, in Butterly and APPERFILL's view, a considerable executive function, perhaps also language that infants don't possess. Perhaps the authors also say that in adults, we also have an implicit and explicit understanding of belief. So, for example, when you're playing a game of sport, this is not something I can understand, but let me, for those of you who do sport, let me explain it. When you're doing something physical with another individual, you anticipate their moves, and you don't have time to represent yourself. He thinks I'm going to go left, so I will go right. You don't have time to do that. You're moving and feinting, or whatever the word is, in sword play, on instinctive grounds, based on reading the body language of the person next to you. And it's implicit, not explicit. And perhaps we also know that about other people without having any kind of explicit understanding. However, there's a slower kind of theory of mind in which you make judgments, you weigh opinions, and so forth, and surely that requires this explicit formulation in the mind. APPERLY and BUTTERFILL, in this nice review, are searching for a clear-cut differentiation between what infants can do and what 4-year-olds can do, much the way people in the number domain have tried to indicate that what infants can do is limited. It's got a signature property that infants can only do arithmetic with the numbers 1, 2, and 3. They can't do arithmetic with higher numbers. Maybe there's something also special about the early understanding of theory of mind in infants that separates their understanding from what a 4-year-old can do. So, for example, does it have limited flexibility? Southgate has an interesting position. She doesn't believe that the infants are just doing it on the basis of behavior rules, which is a proposal by Joseph Perner, that infants are using something like, people look in the last place the object was, just purely on the basis of habit, right? That they've built up this rule. They haven't any understanding of mind. They just have an understanding of what people do in different circumstances. Southgate doesn't believe that, and she has lots of good reasons for arguing it. She thinks also that the gap is not due to inhibitory control, because she thinks her own tasks actually require a certain amount of inhibitory control. In fact, what she says is that what the infants are doing in her type of task, with the 2 doors and the box and so forth, is they only consider the agent's representation of the scene. They never compare it to their own knowledge. So they're very good at reading agents and their interpretation of the world in front of them, but they never put that in juxtaposition with their own perspective. They never regard it as false. And what comes in at 4 is the ability to actually make a meta judgment of the comparison between what the agent thinks and what you think. I'm not totally satisfied with this position, but it's close to the view that perhaps infants have a more limited representation that involves reading intention. The alternative, if one makes the assumption that what infants are doing is not a fully fledged understanding of beliefs, it still raises the possibility that language provides linguistic structures that enhance the representational capacity relevant to representing the content of minds in the way I described earlier with proposals about things like opacity and falsity and recursion. Perhaps the child in that gap between 1 and 4 is learning the syntax and semantics for differentiating between his own reality and that in somebody else's mind. And that's what allows them to do the complicated tasks at age 4. So I have argued that what complements allow is the representation of truth and falsity in someone else's mind, distinct from the world as represented in our mind. And from that representation, reasoning can proceed about what the person will do, why the person did what they did, and so on, to explain as well as to predict. And the syntax and meaning of complement clauses can be learned initially from verbs of communication, like somebody said, proposition P, where you can witness an act of speech, but you can't witness an act of thought. But it so happens that verbs of communication and verbs of thought have incredibly close parallels, so the child can begin to understand complementation via verbs of communication as the bridge to verbs of thinking. So on this second model, the infant has some kind of implicit understanding of others' intentions, but not beliefs, and the gap between 1 and 4 is what's needed for linguistic skills to represent reality versus the states of mind in somebody else's mind. So, as I showed some of you yesterday, I have this task for testing complement understanding, where we say to the child, for example, the woman said the girl had a bug in her hair, but it was only a leaf. What did the woman say the girl had in her hair? And very parallel to what happens in the false belief task, 3-year-olds answer a leaf, which is what she really had in her hair, and 4-year-olds answer a bug. Okay? To get the right answer, the child has to know that the complement clause is embedded. It's not just a question of what did the girl have in her hair, and not just a question of what did the woman say, but it's a question of what did the woman say the girl had in her hair. So you have to take into account both clauses in order to answer it. That's a special feature of complementation. And what we've shown in a number of different studies is that ability to do this task is a very good predictor of false belief performance of the explicit sort that comes in at age 4. So, for example, in longitudinal studies that have looked at children over time, we have tested language acquisition and development of false belief understanding in the age between 3 and 4, when this transition is happening. And what we found was the language predicted theory of mind reasoning, not the other way around. And I must confess, a matter of truth in the history of science, is that when I began this project, I thought it was going to be the other way around. I thought children needed false belief understanding in order to understand complements. So this was a genuine surprise. I didn't go into this expecting it to be this way around. What we found, though, is that understanding the complement clauses was a better predictor of later mastery of false belief than were other measures of general language, for example, mean length of utterance, or cataloging the complex clauses in the child's own speech. Those were much weaker predictors than understanding complements in our task. if the story about complements is the right one, we shouldn't just find correlations, but we should in fact find a strict contingency. So we found it in our own longitudinal study. It was only when children passed the complement task that they were able to succeed to a satisfactory level in theory of mind. And then I also did a larger project in which we were developing a language assessment test for children, and it so happened to have complement examples in it and also theory of mind examples, like I showed you with this story that's part of this project for assessment. And we looked at the relationship between complement mastery and false belief mastery in a large sample of kids, and you can see the results here. This, of course, should be 0 if I'm completely right, but only 11 were the wrong way round. That is, those were children who failed the false complement but managed to give the right answer on a false belief task. But you can see it's perfectly possible to pass the false complement task and still fail the false belief task. It isn't instantaneous, but nevertheless, it is more difficult to fail the false complement task and pass the false belief task. So the contingency works. Now, this is the model I put up a moment ago. Other people have argued, well, of course there's a correlation with the complement task because that task itself is just a variety of an executive function task. So what you're really proving is that executive function is necessary for theory of mind. You have to resist the pull of reality. It's just a variety of executive function tasks. And other people have argued that the complement task is just a variety of theory of mind task. So they subsume the complement task under one of their favorite theories and say that the finding is not meaningful. I argue against both of those in things that I've written, and I'll show you some evidence against the first in a moment. So we had the opportunity to test a very large number of children in a preschool intervention study that we were involved in. We were the researchers who were interested in the relationship between language, theory of mind, and executive function. Other people were interested in general language development, literacy development, emotional development. It's a huge, one of these huge studies that National Institutes of Health fund in America, in particular to try and improve the preschool experience for, in particular, low-income kids in rather poor daycare preschool situations. They're trying to discover, what works and what doesn't. So this was an attempt to implement a new preschool intervention, and we were there to measure the children's success in various things. So there were 2 cohorts that were studied longitudinally. One of them is the most important one from our perspective because they were ages 3 to 5 and then beyond. So we could really do theory of mind and language measures. The younger ones were younger at the beginning, and they didn't. We did some theory of mind as they matured into the older age range. Okay. So the primary child data of interest to us from this is a battery of language acquisition measures, standardized tests of syntax and vocabulary, complement comprehension, a spoken narrative that we gave the children, and a battery of social cognition measures, the most important being a big set of measures of executive functioning, and lots of explicit theory of mind understanding tasks. And what we did was model in structural equation modeling, more sophisticated than my little earlier regressions and contingency analyses. We tried to measure how these things changed over time and which were the most important predictors of how the child did on theory of mind. And in particular, we had the assistance of 2 brilliant statistics students who helped us with the structural equation modeling, which is something that's developed since I was in graduate school, which is always difficult to master new statistics. So be prepared for something horrible to come up on the screen. Okay, so this is the kind of thing that you usually see in social psych or educational modeling. It's very unusual, I think, in cognitive, but what we're trying to do is ultimately predict how the children did on false belief at a later time, in the time 3 that we tested, from a variety of other measures like age, verbal memory, vocabulary, complement syntax, inhibitory control, which is the measure of executive function that's been most closely tied to these theories, and false belief at time 1. So you've got all of these things that predict how the child does on false belief at time 1, and of course it is a major predictor of how the child does on false belief at time 2, but you can, what a structural equation modeling allows you to do is tease apart the independent contributions of each of these things. What you can find is that complement syntax and vocabulary and inhibitory control are all very good predictors of how the child does in the beginning of the year when we're first measuring executive function. And so each of the stories, if you like, general language is good, vocabulary is good, inhibitory control is good, complement comprehension is good, they all predict how the child does at the beginning, and then the question can be asked, what happens near the end. But first I want to show you just an interesting little side note. Complement syntax, in fact, predicts inhibitory control, not vice versa. So it's not the case that the complement syntax task is just being fed by executive function. It's actually, the relationship is the other way around. That's one point to notice. And then the second point to notice is that at time 3, is an even better fit to the model. And what you discover is that inhibitory control is no longer predictive of complement syntax, and complement syntax is one major predictor of false belief reasoning, and inhibitory control no longer predicts it. So let me see if I can summarize that in words. What it means is that executive function is a critical development independent of language, but it's not the proximal predictor, it's not the closest predictor of how the child does on false belief understanding. A more proximal predictor is their capacity to do this complement syntax task. That result explains why, a result that Stephanie, I think, will also talk about this afternoon, we have found that language-delayed children, in particular deaf children, who are delayed in language, have delays in theory of mind understanding, but they do not have delays in executive functioning to the same degree. So if executive function was all you needed for theory of mind understanding, that result shouldn't happen. But if in fact the most important thing is complement syntax, that result is understandable. So complement understanding makes a unique prediction, and we've also, I mentioned yesterday, training studies that have tried to train complement understanding have shown impact on false belief understanding. So that's another reason to think that causal link is significant. Okay, so I want to move then to this question of, model 2, where we, for the moment, bracket the question of what the infant understands and assume that there is something meaningful and new that's happening at age 4. Executive function doesn't seem to be the cause of the change. It's something to do with language, but what kind of language? So I've made the argument so far that complement syntax is a very good possibility for representing that knowledge, but is it really the only possibility? Perhaps, as Paul Harris has argued, children who are engaged in conversation and dialogue with other people learn a lot about the content of their minds. They use different words, they say different things about objects. Perhaps with all the devices in language for perspective taking, that's what gives the child this advantage at age 4. Is it really that complementation is so special? And what if a language existed that didn't have embedded So there has been some argument that there are languages in the world that don't have embedded complements under verbs like think and believe. For example, the piraha in the Amazon are argued not to have recursive embedded structures involving the mind. So would that mean that an adult in piraha would not be able to have a representational system for false belief? It's a worrying concept. So we'll take a look at the evidence for that. All right. So, part 2. I've been interested for some time in manifestations of point of view on a variety of different linguistic forms. And perhaps, as I argued, somebody like Paul Harris would say that it's the accumulation of these perspective changes through linguistic experience that give the child the ability to appreciate representation of mind in somebody else. And there's certainly evidence, lots of evidence by Ruffman, by Dunn, and so forth, other people, that the richness of the linguistic experience that the child has predicts how early they understand theory of mind. So looking at family discourse, for example, Dunn has found that the more older siblings a child has, the better off they are in terms of getting theory of mind, because presumably there's lots of arguments about who thinks what toy belongs to who or something like that. So the child is engaged in lots of rich perspective taking and arguing about rights and so forth that a solitary child may not experience. And other people have shown, sadly, social class effects where a child who is growing up in a home in which they're not receiving enough rich linguistic input is going to be slower at both language and theory of mind than a child who's growing up in a home in which there is a lot of rich linguistic experience. Very political matter, which I have some views about, but I won't go into it now. So let's look at the ways that point of view gets manifest in a language like English. For example, pronouns switch according to the speaker. Obviously, I am I, but you think you are I, right? So we have a different opinion about when I should be used, and same with you. My and your have different meanings for different speakers, different reference for different speakers at least. And then there are cases like spatial deixis, things like here and there, or this and that, which change spatial location depending on who's speaking. The child must notice that that is different. Taste adjectives, for example, things like yucky or tasty or nice or horrible or ugly are just perspectives of given individuals. And then there are designations. Again, a question about this issue of referential opacity. Things like a given referent might just be a dog to one person. It might be Rover to the owner of the dog. It might be my aunt's pet to somebody else who knows it with a different description. Or the winner of the local dog show, which might be specialized knowledge that only one individual knows. And then there is the case of complement representation, something like Jill thinks that France is a monarchy, which I've argued is nicely available to offer a perspective on different truths from one individual to another. So some years ago, Peggy Speece gave a very nice presentation, which I'm going to borrow, in which she lays out the argument that children can in fact handle alternative perspectives in language as long as they are compatible. And then the tricky question is, what does that mean? So she considered these things like indexicals, like pronouns, spatial terms. She considered pretense or possible worlds. She considered personal taste adjectives, and in contrast, different beliefs about the same world. And so let's look at her little diagrams. I tried to take the animations off these. I hope it worked. Oh, good. So here's a case of indexicals. Oh, for some reason the piggy bank has disappeared. I had a piggy bank right there and it's gone. You have to imagine the piggy bank, I'm sorry. It was true a moment ago until I took the animations off that she had a piggy bank. Anyway, Kim says, I have a piggy bank here, which she does in my original picture, and Pat, it's not true. He can't utter that sentence truly because he doesn't have a piggy bank. And we know that children master these indexicals quite long before they pass false belief tasks. So things like pronouns, start coming in at around age 2, words, spatial words like this and that, and here and there. They're not so great in comprehension, but they're certainly there in production very early on, and children do appropriately change perspective. So that's something that's there really early. This is a different possible world. Kim is in the world of Sesame Street, and Pat is in the world of ordinary life, and Kim utters the sentence that is true for him: green monsters live in garbage cans. That's a character from Sesame Street, Oscar the Grouch. But in Pat's world, there are no monsters in his garbage cans. He's living in reality, and children seem to understand the difference between pretense, things seen on TV or in books, and alternative realities well before they pass false belief tasks. I'm slightly worried about my grandson. I think he's destined to be a philosopher, because he said, I think this world is a book that Mommy and I are reading, and we are just characters in it. This was at 3. This is a little worrying. So he may not make a distinction. For him, everything is just a mental world. All right, so they can handle this kind of stuff before they can handle false beliefs. Different spatial perspectives. It's true for Kim that the ball is behind the wall, but it's not true for Pat. For Pat, the ball is in front of the wall if they're standing on either side of the wall. Children understand that the same object can have a different position from different perspectives, and that both are compatible. Different perspectives or desires. Notice I added a little tongue to Kim. So Pat says spinach is delicious. Kim says, eh, right? So young children understand that people differ in their personal tastes. That's what by Gottnick and so forth. Different designations of an object. So Pat says it's a Burmese short hair, and Kim doesn't know that fact about the cat. To him, it's just a cat. Young children do understand that people differ in their understanding of an object. So if it's a compatible description, they may learn from something like this. So, in the future, Kim might say, it's a Burmese short hair, because it's compatible with it being also a cat. However, different knowledge of the world. Kim saw a cat walk behind the wall, but it's no longer there. He says it's a cat. There's not a cat behind the wall anymore, it's just a ball, so that is false for Pat. And this is what's tested in classic false belief tasks. One person knows thinks they know one thing, and another person thinks they know another thing. And this is what children of the same age that can do all of those other things can't seem to represent. So failing this kind of test doesn't necessarily mean that children fail to understand that there are different perspectives. Because in all those other respects, they understand different perspectives. It's just this one. So what's unique about this one? 3-year-olds do understand that different people have different minds. They can understand indexicals, they can understand different possible worlds, they can understand different spatial orientations, different preferences or desires, perhaps different construals of the same object. But what they don't understand is different understandings of the true state of this world. Perner made the proposal that children can understand that minds are different as long as the two minds are compatible. So Kim is I to Kim, and you to Pat. Here to Kim is there to Pat. Green monsters are in Kim's world, but not in Pat's. Spinach is delicious to Kim, but not to Pat. The cat is a Burmese short hair to Kim, but not to Pat. But an object can't be a cat to Pat and a ball to Kim, right? That's just not going to happen. I think I said that the wrong way around, but you know what I mean. If Kim just considers Pat wrong, then he won't be able to predict or explain his actions. He's got to understand the content of Pat's belief in order to engage in reasoning and explanation. Okay. So consider again complements of mental state, that is, sentences under verbs of mental state. The policeman thought he caught me. Notice me, the pronoun, is still my pronoun. It's not the policeman's pronoun. It stayed the same in the complement. The policeman, that the speaker is referring to me, not the policeman, right? The policeman thought he caught me over there. Me and over there are still my perspective. The policeman thought he caught me over there, and by that light, I'm trying to, multiply the number of different perspective-taking terms. They're still all mine, the speakers. When it comes to these type, the policeman thought he caught a Burmese short hair. Well, did he? I know it is a Burmese short hair, but does the policeman? Somehow, I now have to take into account what the policeman knows, not just what I know. Or the policeman thought he caught an adorable cat. Is that my perspective or the policeman's? I think you can kind of get both. There's a difference between pronouns and spatial deixis, which continue to be the speaker's point of view, and nouns and taste adjectives that seem to require that the point of view of the subject of the sentence be taken into account. And this perspective sensitivity of personal taste adjectives is affected by the structural factor. So I'm not sure if Hazel's going to mention this afternoon, but people who worry about words like adorable and yucky and nice and so forth say that one possible semantic perspective is that they take their meaning from some judge in the context. And you choose the judge on the basis of purely contextual semantic factors. But in fact, they are limited by the structural factor of whether they're in a complement or not. That limits who the judge is.